My name is Brynn, and I am 29 years old. For most of my adult life, I let my family believe their version of me, because I assumed somewhere underneath the cruelty, they loved me enough to eventually see the truth on their own. They did not. 3 weeks before my brother's wedding, he stood in the middle of Adagio, one of the nicer restaurants in downtown Seattle, surrounded by his fiancée's parents and half a dozen colleagues, and told the table that I survived on grant money and handouts because I couldn't hack it in the real world. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed, easy, practiced. The way you say something you've repeated for so long that it stopped feeling like a lie. I was sitting 4 seats down. I did not say a word. I just reached under the tablecloth, pulled out my phone, and transferred the $3,800 my mother had texted me about an hour earlier. The cost of the private dining room she had booked for this engagement party without telling anyone who was actually going to pay for it. That was the last time I paid for something in silence. But I'll start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. I grew up in the kind of family where appearances were a full-time job. My father, Dwight, had built a mid-sized real estate development firm in the Puget Sound area over 30 years. He was the kind of man who kept a framed quote about discipline behind his desk, and then borrowed against the family home every 4 years to cover casino debts he never mentioned to my mother. My mother, Gloria, spent her considerable energy managing the story of our family, the newsletter version, the Christmas card version, the version she gave at church and at the Rotary Club luncheons she insisted on attending. In that version, my older brother Carter was the visionary, the future of Dwight's firm. The man who was going to take everything their father built and turn it into something even greater. In that version, I was a footnote, a disappointment they had learned to accommodate. Carter is 34. He joined my father's company directly out of college, accepted a senior title he had not earned, and spent the next 8 years doing what golden children do, taking credit for work done by people beneath him, charming clients at expensive dinners, and spending company money with the comfortable confidence of someone who has never once worried about where it comes from. He was good-looking in the way that reads well in a boardroom. Smooth, persuasive. The kind of man who could tell you something false and make it feel like he was doing you a favor. I left. 6 years ago, when it became clear that there was no version of staying in that firm where I would be allowed to actually build anything, I walked out. I used the small inheritance my grandmother left me to complete my architecture license, rented a desk in a shared workspace in Capitol Hill, and started taking on the kinds of urban redevelopment projects nobody else wanted. The complicated ones, the public-private partnerships on blighted properties, the mixed-use developments in neighborhoods that had been written off for a generation. I worked 6-day weeks for 3 years before I brought on my first associate. My family assumed I was struggling. I let them. I let them believe it because explaining would have required a conversation none of us knew how to have, and because my silence was, at that point, the only private thing I still owned. My firm, which I had incorporated under a holding name that bore no resemblance to my own, had by the time of Carter's engagement party, completed 14 projects across the Pacific Northwest and held the development rights to a 17-acre parcel in Seattle's Meridian District. A former industrial corridor the city had been trying to redevelop for a decade. We had been awarded those rights after an 18-month competitive process. It was the largest urban renewal contract in the city's recent history. The press had covered it twice. Carter had not read either article. He had, however, spent the better part of 8 months trying to get a meeting with the firm that held those rights. That firm was mine. His proposals had come through our acquisitions inbox. His name was on all of them. I had read everyone personally, and I had asked my director of business development to keep the conversations open while our due diligence team did what it always did. Look at the numbers, verify the claims, document the discrepancies. Carter's firm was not what his proposals said it was. I knew that before I read a single quarterly statement. I had grown up watching my father run the same play. The night of the engagement party, I had no intention of doing anything except surviving dinner without incident. I arrived at Adagio at 7. The private dining room was warm with candlelight and the low hum of overlapping conversation. Carter stood near the bar in a perfectly fitted navy blazer, his arm around his fiancée Tatum, who was cheerful, from money, reliably pleasant. She smiled at me when I walked in. Her smile was genuine. I liked her for that. Carter acknowledged me the way you acknowledge furniture. I found a seat near the middle of the table. The dinner began. The wine was very good. At some point, one of Tatum's relatives, a woman with silver earrings who had flown in from Portland, asked me what I did. Before I could answer, Carter looked down the table. She does design work, he said, in the tone someone might use to explain that their cat knocks things off shelves. Non-profit stuff mostly. Community projects. She bounced around a lot after school. It took a while to figure out that corporate wasn't really her thing. He smiled, the kind of smile meant to seem charitable. We're proud of her for finding something she enjoys. There was a small, polite murmur from the table. The woman with the silver earrings made a soft sound of acknowledgement and redirected her attention to her wine. My mother glanced in my direction with an expression I recognized. A kind of tired, preemptive apology, the expression of someone who has decided it is too late to stop something and has chosen to look mildly sad about it instead. I picked up my fork. I did not correct him. What I noticed instead was the man sitting diagonally across from Carter. His place card read Logan. He was Carter's roommate from law school, now working in private equity. Carter had mentioned him occasionally over the years in that particular way people mention impressive friends, as accessories to their own status. Logan had been half listening to the conversation at his end of the table, but when Carter said non-profit stuff and gestured toward me, Logan glanced in my direction. The glance lasted approximately 2 seconds before he returned to his conversation, but something in his posture changed. A slight stiffening. The kind of recalibration that happens when a person hears something that does not quite fit what they already know. I noted it and said nothing. The rest of the dinner proceeded the way dinners like that proceed. Carter gave a toast. It was long. It was mostly about himself. Tatum laughed in the right places. Dessert came. The check came with it, and my mother found me near the coat check before anyone else could see, pressed her hand against my arm and told me in a low voice that she had forgotten the card she intended to use. And would I mind just putting it on mine this time? She would pay me back. You know how things get. I put it on mine. $3,800. I did not ask her to pay me back. I already knew she would not. What I did not expect was what happened in the parking garage afterward. I was walking to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. Quick, deliberate. I turned. It was Logan. He stopped a few feet away. The garage was mostly empty. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has spent the last 2 hours trying to figure out whether he was imagining something and has finally decided he is not. I'm sorry to stop you, he said. I have to ask, the firm you run, is it Cordell Urban Partners? I looked at him. I did not answer immediately, but I did not deny it either. Why do you ask? I said. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Because I'm the lead investor on a project that's been trying to get a seat at the table with Cordell for 6 months. And I've done enough research on that firm to know that the founder is a woman in her late 20s, who built it from nothing, and who holds the Meridian District rights. He looked at me steadily. And Carter has been telling everyone his firm is on the verge of closing a deal on those same rights. I held his gaze. Carter's proposals came to us through the standard acquisition channel, I said. They're currently under review. Logan stared at me for a long moment, then something moved through his expression. Not quite pity, not quite shock. Something closer to the specific kind of awe that comes from realizing you have profoundly misread a room. He has no idea, Logan said. He does not, I confirmed. He was quiet for another moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and said, I'm going to need to make a phone call. I told him to take his time, then I got in my car and drove home. The weeks that followed were what my family would later call the calm before everything fell apart. From the outside, nothing seemed to change. Carter continued his campaign to impress Tatum's family. My parents continued to plan a June wedding with a guest list that had somehow grown to 230 people. I continued to go to work, manage my firm, and appear at family dinners when summoned, where I sat quietly and absorbed whatever passing comment Carter chose to deliver about my lifestyle or my finances. But underneath that surface, things were moving. Logan had made his phone call the night of the engagement party. By the following week, my business development team had been in contact with his firm about a legitimate investment partnership on the Meridian project, one that had nothing to do with Carter. My legal team had also, at my direction, initiated a formal review of all proposals submitted by Carter's firm, cross-referencing their claimed revenue figures against public filings and third-party vendor records. What they found was not surprising, it was, however, thorough. Carter had been diverting operating funds from my father's company into a separate LLC he controlled. The transfers were structured to stay below the threshold that typically triggers automatic review. He had been doing it for at least 4 years. The total, conservatively estimated, was somewhere north of $180,000. The money had gone to cover personal credit card balances, the lease on a car he described to my parents as a company vehicle, and most recently the deposits on a wedding venue that cost more per hour than most people make in a week. He had been planning to use the Meridian deal to make it all disappear. A single large capital infusion would have covered the gap and left him looking like a success story. The deal was not going to close, it never had been. 2 weeks before the wedding, my parents held what they called a family dinner. This was their term for the occasion when they had something to say and needed an audience to say it to. I drove to the house I grew up in, a large colonial in Bellevue, that my father had mortgaged and remortgaged, and that I had quietly been paying the property taxes on for 3 years. After discovering that the county had sent 2 delinquency notices my parents had filed, unopened, in a kitchen drawer. The table was set nicely, Gloria had made a roast, the good dishes were out. I recognized this as theater. My father stood at the head of the table after dinner and said that he and my mother had decided to formalize the transfer of the family business to Carter before the wedding. A good faith gesture, a sign of confidence. He said Carter had brought new energy to the firm and had real momentum on a major development deal that would secure the company's future. He said this was, of course, what they had always hoped for. Then he looked at me. He said they loved me and wanted the best for me, but the family business required focus, and Carter's focus was total, and mine had always been. He searched for a word elsewhere. He said the formal transition meant I would not be included in the equity restructuring. He said they hoped I understood. My mother nodded throughout. Carter refilled his own glass and said nothing, because he did not need to say anything. The silence was his agreement. I sat with my hands in my lap and looked at my father. I thought about the property tax notices in the kitchen drawer. I thought about the $3,800 charge on my credit card statement. I thought about 4 years of holiday dinners where Carter's name was said like a word for abundance, and my name was said like a word for weather, mentioned briefly, not really expected to do anything. I understand, I said. Carter smiled at his wine. I drove home that night and sent a single email to my legal team with 3 words: proceed with disclosure. The wedding venue was a restored event hall on the waterfront, high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the Sound that had cost Carter 3 months of diverted operating funds to secure. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a dress the color of deep water, and found my assigned seat at a round table near the side of the room, not near the windows, near the kitchen. I was seated between 2 of my mother's college friends who had no idea who I was. I did not mind, I needed a clear sightline to the room, not a view of the water. Logan was there. We had spoken briefly during cocktail hour, a firm handshake, a steady look, the kind of exchange between 2 people who share a piece of information and are each waiting for the right moment. He had brought a colleague named Dara who worked in commercial real estate and who, I suspected, knew exactly as much as Logan did about the evening ahead. They sat 2 tables away from me, close enough. And then there was Mr. Sullivan. Arthur Sullivan was the Director of Development Partnerships at the city's Office of Housing, the man who had overseen the competitive process that awarded my firm the Meridian District rights. He was also, as it happened, a wedding guest. He and my father had been in the same civic organization for 20 years. He was a tall man, 60 or so, with the composed and unsentimental manner of someone who had spent decades reading proposals and deciding which ones were worth believing. He did not know Carter personally. Carter had been trying to change that for months. The toasts began an hour into the reception. Tatum's father gave a warm one, Carter's best man gave a long one. Then Carter himself stood, glass in hand, and the room settled into the kind of attention that gathers around a man who has spent his whole life practicing his own confidence. He thanked Tatum's family. He thanked the guests for traveling. He thanked his parents for everything they had built. And then he paused in a way that signaled he was about to pivot. I also want to take a moment, he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, to talk about where this family is headed, because I think it's important that the people in this room know what they're celebrating. He talked about the firm, he talked about growth, he talked about the Meridian District deal in language designed to sound authoritative, citing the acreage, the projected value, the partnerships he claimed were nearly finalized. He spoke with the specific certainty of a man who has confused an email thread for a closed transaction. And then he turned his gaze toward the table near the kitchen. Some of you may have met my sister Brynn tonight, he said. She's here somewhere. Brynn, wave so people can find you. He did not wait for me to wave. Brynn has been doing her own thing for a few years now, design projects, she says, small stuff. I've always admired that she found something she enjoys even if it's, well, he smiled, not quite what we'd hoped for her. Some people are built more for the personal side of things than the business side, and that's okay. The laughter that rippled through the room was light, charitable. The laugh you give when you're not sure if something is a joke. I set down my water glass. I did not rush. I pushed back my chair slowly, the way you push back from a table when you have finished eating and there is nowhere particular you need to be. I picked up the leather portfolio I had placed under my chair when I arrived. I walked toward the front of the room. In 10 steps I was standing at the edge of the small raised platform where Carter and Tatum stood. Carter's smile stayed fixed for exactly 1 second after he registered I was there, then it went uncertain. Brynn, he said, the microphone picked it up. I took the 3 steps onto the platform. I extended my hand toward him, the same gesture he had used 1,000 times, the one that says give me the thing. After a half-second of visible confusion, he handed me the microphone. I turned to face the room. I'm sorry to interrupt the toasts, I said. I'll be brief. I opened the portfolio. My brother mentioned the Meridian District Development Project, I said. Since we're talking about business, I think it's a reasonable time to address it directly. I placed the first document on the table beside me. A printed copy of the recorded deed showing Cordall Urban Partners as the holder of the Meridian District Development rights. Large enough to read from the front row. Cordall Urban Partners holds the city-awarded development rights to the Meridian site, I said. Carter's firm submitted 7 proposals to our acquisitions team between September and April of this year. None of those proposals met our operating standards, and no agreement has been reached or is currently pending. The room had gone very quiet. Carter said something. Without the microphone, his voice came out thin and strange. I placed the second document beside the first. This is a summary prepared by our financial review team, I said. It documents a pattern of internal fund transfers within my father's company, totaling approximately $180,000 over 4 years, routed through a separate LLC controlled by Carter. The full documentation has been provided to the appropriate authorities. Someone at a front table made a short, involuntary sound. I did not look to see who it was. I want to be clear about something, I said. I did not come here tonight to hurt my brother. I came here 6 years ago and 3 years ago and last Thanksgiving and the one before that, and every time I came I sat quietly while the story of this family was told in a way that made me smaller and smaller. I let it happen because I thought silence was a kind of mercy. I was wrong. Silence is not mercy, it is permission. I looked at Carter. He had gone very still. Tatum beside him had taken 1 small step sideways, the kind of movement that isn't quite a decision yet, but is the beginning of one. Cordall Urban Partners, I continued, returning my gaze to the room, is my firm. I founded it 6 years ago. We currently employ 42 people. We are the firm that holds the Meridian District rights, and we were awarded those rights because our proposal was the strongest one submitted. I paused. My brother has spent 8 months trying to acquire those rights from a company he did not know I ran. From somewhere near the center of the room, Arthur Sullivan set down his fork. He stood slowly with the deliberate composure of someone who does not need to rush to be heard. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at me across the room with the expression of a man running a very rapid internal calculation, and then he walked toward the platform with the measured pace of someone who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. He stepped up beside me. He did not reach for the microphone, he did not need it. His voice carried naturally. "For what it's worth," Sullivan said, addressing the room with the particular authority of a public official who has nothing to prove, "the city's development office has worked closely with Cordale Urban Partners on the Meridian project for the past 2 years. Their work has been exceptional. The rights were awarded through an open competitive process, and they were awarded because they submitted the strongest proposals by a significant margin." He looked at me briefly, then back at the room. "I wasn't aware until this moment that the founding partner was related to anyone in this room. But I'm glad the record is clear." He returned to his table and picked his fork back up. The room did not restart right away. It stayed quiet for a moment that stretched longer than rooms usually allow. That particular silence that happens when a significant number of people are simultaneously revising their understanding of what they believed was true. Then it fractured. Not into chaos but into the urgent lowered voice murmur of 200 people turning to each other with the same sentence forming in all their mouths at once. Tatum's mother said something to Tatum's father. My mother pressed both hands flat on her table. My father, who had turned the color of old ash, reached for his water glass and missed it entirely. Carter found his voice. "Brynn, this is not the time or the place." He reached toward the microphone and I moved it slightly and he stopped. "These are serious claims. You could be making a serious mistake." "I'm not," I said. "The documents could be misread." "They were reviewed by 3 independent attorneys," I said, "and the Federal Financial Crimes Unit has had the summary since Thursday." Carter looked at me. For the first time in as long as I could remember, he had no available move. Tatum had taken the second step sideways. "Carter," she said very quietly, "it was not a question." He turned to look at her. Whatever he saw in her face made him stop trying to speak. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has just understood something important and is deciding in real time what to do with it. "I need some air," she said. She stepped off the platform without looking at anyone and walked toward the side doors, and her mother was up from her table before Tatum had gone 3 steps, and her father followed, and then 2 aunts, and they all moved through the room with the quiet, coordinated speed of a family executing a decision they hadn't discussed, but all agreed on. Carter stood on the platform alone. My mother had covered her mouth with both hands. My father stared at the tablecloth. I placed the portfolio flat on the table beside the document. "One more thing," I said to the room. "The property tax delinquency notices on our family home in Bellevue. I've been paying those for 3 years because I found them in a kitchen drawer and didn't want my parents to lose the house. That account is current. They don't owe me anything for it." But I wanted it said out loud, in a room full of people who have been told a very specific story about who contributes to this family, that the record of that story was always incomplete. I stepped off the platform. Logan stood as I passed his table. He didn't say anything. He just stood and Dara stood beside him, and when I passed he gave me a brief nod that carried the weight of everything he already knew and had been waiting to see confirmed. Arthur Sullivan, returning to his dinner, glanced up and gave me the same nod. I retrieved my coat from the coat check. The attendant handed it over without quite meeting my eye, which told me he had been listening to every word from his little alcove near the hall entrance. I did not blame him. The door was heavier than I expected going out, or maybe it was just the contrast with the noise inside. The sound of a story that would spend the rest of the night unraveling itself, in that room full of expensive flowers and people who would be talking about this dinner for years. The valet brought my car around without being asked. The Seattle night was cold and clear and smelled like the water. I drove home along the waterfront with the windows cracked and the heat on, which is the contradictory thing you do when you are 29 years old and have spent 6 years building something real and quiet in the place where your family expected to find nothing at all. The city lights reflected off the sound in long broken lines the way lights always do on moving water, present, then scattered, then present again in a different shape. I had grown up looking at that water and thinking it belonged to people who were not me. I drove until the skyline was behind me. Then I was just driving, and the road was dark and straight, and it was enough.